Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, ATSDR set up a Community Advisory Group, or CAG, for spill victims, and a power struggle quickly developed between ACCEH and the new Mineral County Sanitarian, who became head of the CAG. We now conclude Part 3, The Long Haul, with Chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9, Phase 1. ATSDR released a draft of the long-anticipated Phase 1 health survey in June of 1998, considered significant because little information existed on community-wide chlorine gas releases. 682 evacuees were interviewed 12 to 16 days after the initial release. About 82% reported at least one adverse acute health effect from the spill, the most common being respiratory and eye problems and headaches. By the time of the interviews, headaches and eye complaints had resolved in 2/3 of the people who originally suffered them, and half of the respiratory complaints had resolved. Other common problems included vomiting and skin damage. Less common other problems included stress and anxiety, gastrointestinal problems, problems sleeping, mood disorders, fatigue, pain, problems of memory or concentration, and dizziness. Acute hypersensitivity, or chemical sensitivity per se, was not listed as a symptom category, despite that health officials had recognized sensitivity to chlorinated pools and more general sensitivity prior to reentry. Respiratory symptoms, skin problems, and other problems had the highest rates of unresolved symptoms after 2 weeks. Current and past smokers, as well as people with a history of asthma, chronic bronchitis, and hay fever, had much more symptomology. Together, these made a large susceptible subpopulation. The survey also asked people permitted to return home for brief visits during the evacuation whether they experienced symptoms during the visits, presumably new or aggravated symptoms. Half of the visitors, 155 people, reported feeling ill. Among the wide range of symptoms, burning sensation in the eyes and throat, cough, shortness of breath, painful breathing, nausea, rashes, and other led the list. Those who returned to visit had a 17% higher rate of a burning sensation in the eyes and a 29% higher rate of nasal irritation compared with non-visitors. This was very interesting information, though not commented upon in the report. If nothing but chlorine spilled and chlorine was monitored as being at safe levels in the areas visited, why did so many people have reactions to the visits? Were they being re-exposed and exhibiting sensitivity? What about people visiting who had not been originally exposed? Or people allowed to return to areas open early to permanent reentry? What did this data suggest about health officials allowing people to visit? The study did not pose these questions or interpret this data. Nor did the interviewers ask if people smelled anything upon their visits, despite that these interviews took place after publicity about a pesticide-like odor in areas people visited. Ellen Leahy helped ATSDR design the survey. On its face, the data suggested that allowing people to visit resulted in exposures, symptoms, and injury. Anecdotal testimony confirmed that some people were seriously affected by visits to the exclusion zone, and some even suffered first-time exposures from spill chemicals, injury, and even subsequent chronic illness. In discussing results, ATSDR said initial chlorine exposure concentrations were estimated to be as high as, quote, 20 parts per million intermittently, but didn't elaborate on any error models for that estimation. The immediately dangerous to life and health level, the IDLH, was 10 parts per million. Vague as it was, this was the first published government estimation of exposure. Notably, ATSDR assumed a modeled exposure level that was not mild to moderate, as pushed by officials during the spill, undermining many of the assurances regarding general recovery. During the evacuation, public health officials and the media gave the impression that the vast majority of people were not susceptible to long-term problems, and only a minority, such as smokers and those with pre-existing respiratory problems, had greater risk. In fact, it may be that the majority of people were susceptible to greater risk of chronic illness, if the ideal was someone with a current history of, at the very least, non-smoking, no allergies, no asthma, and no bronchitis. Information on chlorine suggested that young children and the elderly were also more susceptible. Additionally, moderate to severe exposures in Alberton, as models suggested had occurred, further implied higher risk for chronic injury. Based on their data, ATSDR recommended a follow-up study, now done, due to the high percentage of people reporting health effects and the, quote, contradictory conclusions in the medical literature about the prevalence of chronic effects from chlorine. During the spill, victims heard nothing about such contradictory conclusions and were generally assured there would be no chronic illness. ATSDR also recommended providing environmental health education to the local health providers to optimize local medical support for the affected community. Advice coming over 2 years post-spill. The upshot: ATSDR would next document chronic effects of chlorine exposure, adding to the limited medical literature. Though not included in the Phase 1 report, ATSDR conducted a separate survey of 23 first responders, likewise interviewed 2 weeks after the spill. An assumption was evident in ATSDR's stated goal to identify symptoms documented in the literature as being consistent with acute chlorine exposure. This meant only questions pertaining to classical chlorine symptomology were asked, eliminating the other category, although the survey acknowledged, quote, a recently recognized syndrome, reactive airways dysfunction syndrome. The survey looked at 2 professional firefighters, 18 volunteer firefighters, and 1 ambulance, evacuation, and hazmat personnel each. All of these responders entered, quote, the Alberton site 2 or more times. Only 7 of these 23 first responders reported being told to wear PPE, personal protection equipment, and only 5 responders reported PPE as available, although only 6 responders answered this latter question. 19 of the responders had hazmat training. 16 of these 23 responders reported health problems, significant because most responders, 16, were not told to wear PPE. Most of the ill responders sought medical help, 11 of 15 answering the question. The 16 ill responders reported symptoms including skin, eye, and respiratory problems, headaches, vomiting, diarrhea, and nausea. All 23 responders claimed to be in excellent or good prior health, though many did smoke or have a history of smoking, and a few had hay fever or asthma. This mini-survey clearly raised questions about assumptions of safety for those responders who had time and distance to prepare for a potential exposure. Either during acute exposure, repeat exposures, or both, unprotected responders had their health compromised. Unwittingly, the Phase 1 survey served as a partial critique on the safety of the response for responders and visiting residents. ATSDR did not conduct baseline tests. Over 2 years after the spill, the survey mainly quantified what victims already knew, that they had suffered acute injury from the spill. That June, the CAG met in Frenchtown in conjunction with ATSDR staff visiting to discuss draft results of Phase 1. Lucinda Hodges and others attended. ATSDR's Dr. Rubina Imtiaz said of Phase 1, the first one wasn't designed to prove anything. It was designed to study the people that were exposed to document their health effects. The main finding, she said, was that 82% of the participants reported at least one effect that related to the spill. People in the middle-age groups had the most symptoms. Perhaps they had more exposure, she said, because of subsequent trips to the evacuation zone. Imtiaz said Phase 2 results were due in the future and would eventually lead to health evaluations and referrals. Dr. Bill Carter, head of ATSDR's Division of Health Education and Promotion, added, however, we are mandated that we cannot do treatment. ATSDR could pay for a referral through a one-time clinical evaluation, but we cannot treat, he said. I must make that clear. ATSDR would not administer any medical monitoring either. After Mosca had turned off her camera, Hodges said Glenn Tucker of ATSDR told local television reporters that they were going to ask the EPA to come back based on complaints they were hearing. Hodges' heart leapt in amazement. ACCEH issued a press release announcing that ATSDR was asking the EPA back in for more chemical testing. On and off-site chemical odors and adverse health effects have prompted this decision by ATSDR, Hodges announced. The group had wondered if it wasn't too late to retest for contamination, but they saw ATSDR's announcement as a big change in policy and hoped the EPA would carry it out. Like many of their press releases, this one was ignored. Chapter 10: Summer of Love and Hate. Exiled from their 9-mile home, Roger and Ada Chalmers returned in late May of 1998. On a pine tree by the driveway to their bucolic nook, they were greeted by a woebegone sign the Chalmers nailed up some years ago. Welcome to the Upper 9-Mile Valley, where all the women are beautiful, all the men are handsome, and all the children have above average intelligence. But first, they had their house remediated by STAT, a Missoula cleaning company, at a cost of $22,000. Roger had STAT use a protocol for cleaning up hydrochloric acid. STAT stripped the house bare, dry vacuumed walls, washed them down with soda, and sealed them with safe coat paint. They hand washed every item. The Chalmers inventoried a pile of things they deemed too contaminated to use. Ada's sandals, for example, she described as melted. With the passing of time and the cleanup, they decided they could live once again in their dream home. I didn't think I could do it, Roger said. I couldn't come in the house before. I couldn't even stand on the grounds for the first 2 years. I'd get that stingy, oh, you'd walk in here and you'd just start burning, Ada finished. After a 2-week trial, they stayed, but remained wary, believing residual contamination lingered in the area. Yet, they accomplished what Lucinda Hodges never would: coming home. In 1998, ACCEH participated in a 2-pronged campaign to phase out chlorine while calling for increased regulation of railroads. Hodges' visit to Love Canal inspired her railroad safety petition. She wrote, "For the prevention of railroad accidents and the catastrophic chemical releases these accidents create, and for public disclosure of rail-transported hazardous chemicals under community right-to-know laws," as part of a coalition. Nationally, 10,000 people evacuated each year because of toxic spills on railroads. The petition called for better FRA oversight, especially for defective and worn rail, and for communities to have more information about hazardous material coming through. Railroads were exempt from any right-to-know laws. The coalition planned on presenting the petition to MRL, BNSF, the FRA, and Montana's 3 congressmen on August 2nd, the 20th anniversary of the order to evacuate 900 families living by the Love Canal chemical dump site, and the planned premiere of Lisa Mosca's film as part of an ACCEH fundraiser. That spring, a Missoula judge had sanctioned MRL for withholding documents concerning railware in the Alberton spill Schlepp case. Now, ACCEH's press release claimed that MRL knew ahead of time that the track involved in the Alberton spill was defective, citing a January 1996 memo by Roadmaster Augie Cantu that said the ball of the rail on Curve 155 was, quote, worn out. The Missoulian ran a brief article on the petition, and the petition and other rail safety material were posted on ACCEH's website. A fact sheet circulated by ACCEH that summer cited an FRA special investigation following the Alberton derailment. The FRA found 28 track-caused derailments on the MRL line from 1991 through 1995, followed by an additional 21 all-cause derailments in the first 4 months of 1996 alone. ACCEH reiterated that MRL had the second highest total of accidents for Class C railroads in 1995 and 1996. While the national average of accidents for Class C railroads dropped 12% between 1995 and 1996, MRL's rate rose 25%. With this publicity, ACCEH had gone beyond health issues and was openly criticizing the safety record of MRL, even as litigation heated up. Hodges told Mosca the MRL documents were a turning point for all of us, that the company had knowledge that they had track that was worn and that they had curve wear problems throughout the entire system. And that was what galvanized us into making the railroad safety petition, because we knew that that was the way to have prevention, she said, of more Albertons. Hodges had no inkling just how big of a turning point awaited her. That summer, Hodges prepared for the fundraiser in coordination with the National Day of Action commemorating the Love Canal anniversary. A month in advance, ACCEH invited key players to the Sunday, August 2nd event. Congressman Rick Hill, Senators Max Baucus and Conrad Burns, DEQ's Tom Ellerhoff, State Health's Todd Damrow, Ellen Leahy of the Missoula Health Department, Governor Mark Roscoe, ATSDR's Chris Poulet, EPA's Chris Weiss, and a seat for one Mineral and Missoula County Commissioner each. None would attend, nor send a representative in lieu of. Lisa really made the whole event, Hodges said, and I thought it was a beautiful event. Held at the Boone and Crockett's Club Church-like Assembly Hall in the old Milwaukee Railroad Station in Missoula along the Clark Fork River, ACCEH hosted the event in part to raise awareness of toxic exposures and the risk of rail transport of hazardous materials. The evening was highlighted by the Montana premiere of the film Love Canal, 20 Years of Struggle, and the draft of Mosca's A Toxic Train Ran Through It, a story of who benefits and who loses in toxic chemical catastrophes. Mosca's 90-minute production told the story of the Alberton derailment and the aftermath for some of the people suffering lasting health effects. Hope Seek led a discussion and analysis of the Alberton spill aftermath following the films, and the evening ended outside by the river with a candlelight vigil in commemoration of Love Canal. The Missoulian provided no coverage. One of the reasons that I took on this project was that people are still suffering from that spill, Mosca said of her film and thesis. There are a lot of people in the larger community of Montana who don't know that these people are still suffering, who don't understand the gravity of the spill, she said. Mosca had a passion for justice. Overall, Hodges thought the event a success and hoped the film could publicize their plight and inform people of the broader issues. But once again, she found her life utterly derailed. A month after the fundraiser, Hodges' husband, Mark Hansen, was working on the railroad on the defunct Milwaukee line at the long tunnel at the top of Lookout Pass on the Idaho border, part of the route of the old Hiawatha passenger train. The Forest Service was converting existing stretches into a hiking and biking trail, the Rails to Trails project. Hansen was happy about the job, though it meant being on the road during the week. Sunday nights, he would stay awake, pack his truck for the work week, and leave Alberton early Monday to be at the job site by daybreak. One Monday in September, he never made it. Hansen was driving Hodges' BMW that morning instead of his truck, intending to fix something on the car later. Around 4 a.m., Missoula police banged on Hodges' trailer door, waking her to say that Hansen was the victim of a brutal attack. Hodges found her husband in a coma at Community Hospital. A security company discovered him on the side of Mullen Road, Hodges said, outside her BMW just west of the Y intersection of I-90, about 10 miles west of Missoula. Hansen had stopped at the Y to gas up and buy food. Responders told Hodges that when they arrived on scene, Hansen was not breathing, that he'd aspirated something and choked. He'd suffered a closed head wound trauma that caved in his skull. They didn't think he would really function again, Hodges said. They didn't know how long he'd gone without oxygen. The coma lasted 7 days. Weeks later, when she read the police report, Hodges thought the attack was a revenge for premiere of the Alberton movie. The fact sheets about MRL's safety record were distributed at the event as well, and still posted on her website. Nothing was stolen, she said. He had his wallet. He was hit on the back of the head. It could have been anything. At first, the police thought he had fallen back on some concrete, but there's no concrete there. So the feeling is that he had been hit from behind with a piece of pipe, something like that. The Missoula County Sheriff's Department did not make a forensic investigation, Hodges said. At first, doctors didn't think Hansen would live, and the police were concerned that they would have a murder on their hands. But once it was clear he would survive, they were totally uninterested, and they never did a damn thing, she said. Nothing. They assigned a detective to it, but he said unless Mark has memories, there's nothing they can do. The police only kept in close contact with her for the first day or two, when they thought Hansen might die. And I wonder too, Hodges said. I always drove the Beamer, and I let Mark only have it if he was fixing it, generally. So I always wondered, did they think it was me? Did they think I was driving it? Previously, Hodges had thought perhaps she was too high of a profile spokesperson for ACCEH to get directly targeted. She said of Hansen, "He has flashes of somebody following him, remembers the car up close behind him, and a certain sign, that he was trying to find a sign, but we couldn't put it together what his memories were. We'll never know what happened, and we'll never know if MRL was behind it. We'll never be able to prove it, but we think it was a result of the derailment. Vengeance against us." Hodges said the security company was the same one at MRL headquarters during the 1997 protests. "I saw their clipboards at the first anniversary," she said. "They had a picture of the old Tracer, her former car, the back of the plate, me, color photos, the whole file right there on that guy's clipboard." She thought the pictures had been taken during the first March protest and recalled people outside in suits with zoom lenses. After Hansen's brutal beating, Hodges recognized the two security employees' names on the police report as the same men from the March 1997 protest, where they wore name tags. She had talked to them that day as she tried to negotiate to get inside MRL headquarters. No one was ever charged in the attack on Hansen. Several other people with lawsuits or a high profile believed that they were targeted for observation, intimidation, and threats, including sabotage of vehicles. While Hansen was in his coma, his brother visited and commented that there were no marks on his hands, no sign that he hit anybody, even in defense. "How could this have happened to Mark and he didn't do anything?" he asked Hodges. The family reasoned the attack had been a cowardly surprise. Hansen was a big man, and there was one unusual wound on his chest. "I remember when I went in to see him in the emergency room," Hodges said, "and they were just getting his clothes, cutting everything off, and the nurse pointed to a bruise and said, 'That's a boot heel. Someone boot heeled him.' That was the only other mark on him," she said. Baited and blindsided, Hansen was branded by one attacker as he lay helpless. While comatose, Hansen fought the bed constraints, and as he came out of the coma, he was just out of his mind, Hodges said. They had to keep him sedated, and he was crazy from the brain injury, literally. They prepped him for surgery. They thought they were going to have to operate and relieve pressure on the brain. The whole front of his brain was all, he looked like an alien. The swelling is in the front of the brain. The doctor said the injury caused a shear in the brain, that the force of the trauma was so hard that his brain moved forward. The worst damage was in the frontal lobe, to the executive part of his brain, the part that allows you to multitask, follow directions, that kind of thing. That's gone. As he struggled out of the coma while constrained, Hansen's arms and legs took a beating. Later, Hodges said, he thought that he'd been bruised in the fight. He broke the bed 3 times. They had to keep him strapped down. It was horrible to watch, but it was a good sign because it meant he had brain activity. Hansen was very strong. He was like a Frankenstein for a long time, Hodges said. He was all body and no brain. Finally came the emotional daybreak. He knew me when he first woke up and could speak. The doctor said, "Do you know who that is?" And he said, "Yes, that's Lucinda." And he said, "I've been looking for her, and I want to go home." So he came out of it with speech and that much knowledge, Hodges said. For the moment, Hodges' worst fears were relieved, and her tears now flowed from cautious joy. But Hansen had much to recover from and entered brain injury rehabilitation at Community Hospital. For several weeks, he relearned basics such as how to use the telephone, gaining ground in some ways but struggling in others. "It was really terrible for me," Hodges said, "because it's hard to see somebody who doesn't really know what they are and who they are again." Her husband, the man she loved. Because the police found no witnesses, Hansen struggled to accept what had happened. His memory of the 3 months before and 3 months after the injury remained scrambled. Even more so than after his chemical injury, Hodges noticed personality changes in her husband, much of it stemming from his frustration over his memory. He often couldn't recall names and struggled with remembering details. Late that fall, after he left the hospital, Hansen once stopped Beverly Ridenour's son in Alberton to ask for directions in his own small town. Hansen gradually improved while going through stages of paranoia and confusion. He resumed working in early January 1999 and improved much during the year. "Sometimes I can actually see the old mark there," Hodges said in early 2000. "I hadn't for a long time. But the attack also brought devastating financial consequences, as Hansen had been the family's sole supporter, and they'd been living paycheck to paycheck. "We weren't that bad financially until the head injury," she said, "but to have 4 months without money." And then late in 1999 came a long layoff and mounting medical bills, despite insurance. Hodges and her family survived by credit cards and small gifts from friends, while under the threat of foreclosure on their Alberton house. The home she had left, but her husband clung to. Despite everyone's concern that he might remain a ward of the state, Hansen far exceeded doctors' hopes. But damage of all sorts had been done. Even if the attackers hadn't been after her specifically, Hodges felt they got what they wanted: significant disruption and strain on her life. "I felt that if they knew it was Mark in the car, and that Mark was the target, then the purpose was to cripple me, because I was totally dependent on Mark financially. Maybe I'm totally wrong, we'll never know. But that was a really dark time," she said. Since the spill, life had been gray at best. With Hodges' world in a free fall, she credited Mosca for supporting her emotionally during these hard times. Mosca even brought food to the hospital for Hodges while she stayed by her husband's side. "If it hadn't been for Lisa," she said, "the group would have just gone to hell, because it had become such a nightmare." In December, ATSDR announced plans for a health evaluation for sometime in 1999, but warned it would be limited by funding constraints. Dr. Cynthia Lewis Younger of a University of Utah clinic would test people according to highest priority groups, and she would choose the final protocol. Hodges, preoccupied by her husband's condition, didn't yet know what to make of the health evaluation. Another year had passed, and spill victims seemed no closer to finding answers to their plight, and now she believed she had been sent a brutal message to stop looking. But they were in this for the long haul. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we begin part 4, Light at the End of the Tunnel. Suffering from chronic illness and convinced the Alberton area is still contaminated, spill victims decide to appeal to the EPA's National Ombudsman, who agrees to take on their case. Meanwhile, the CAG releases their overdue needs assessment. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.